Nobody in our county expected a battle over water to start with a bulldozer. The county meetings were polite, the emails passive-aggressive, and the HOA president had the smile of someone who'd practiced concession speeches in the mirror. The day the machines arrived at the edge of my property, I was in the barn feeding horses, and the first I knew was the sound of metal and the smell of diesel drifting across the prairie. I walked out to see a chain-link fence and surveyors, their flags staked like bones in the grass. A foreman handed me a permit and a plan. The plan claimed an easement, government ordered, to lay a new pipeline that would carry water to the subdivision up on the ridge. They said it cut across county land, but it ran a straight line through my eastern pasture, right by the old windmill that had been my father's and then mine. It was wrong from the start. The permit had smudges, the legal counsel's phone number was out of service, and when I asked to see the property deeds, the foreman shrugged and said he wasn't the lawyer. The neighborhood called it progress. The HOA called it necessity. The machines started trenching, the earth opened like a wound, and the pipe disappeared into it. I spent that night at the ranch house with the lights low and the phone quiet. I pulled the old deed from the safe, the one whose leather smelled like engine oil and summer hay. I read it 3 times. The easement was not on my land. No county had authorized the stretch that cut past my windmill. I called the county recorder at dawn. They told me a different story. They said the HOA's attorney had filed an emergency order last week citing a failing main, a potential contamination, and the need for immediate rerouting. The order had a stamp. It had a signature. It had a fee paid in cash with a receipt that matched a company name I thought was just a utility vendor we worked with for years. I spent the next day pulling records and making calls. The vendor's name was Subtle, an almost forgettable corporation that had supplied meters and filters to a string of rural properties, including mine. I remembered the logo on the trucks that came to service the pump out behind the feed store. When I dug deeper into corporate filings, my stomach dropped to my boots. I owned it. Not just a stake, not a majority by chance. My name, or the shell company's name that I had set up years back when investing quietly, was listed as the principal shareholder. It had been sitting there for a decade, earning steady returns while I tended fences and bred horses. I'd signed the documents in a coffee shop without thinking, as a favor to an old friend who said he wanted to keep our water network local and reliable. He'd promised to run it. I trusted him. He had run it all right. He had sold the idea of an emergency reroute to the HOA, and then signed the fee. The trucks were his. The lawyers were his. The pipeline was his project. They thought they could muscle through, because when you own the well, you carry the pump and the key to whatever's under the ground. I felt 2 things at once, an old man's fury and a younger man's cunning. Instead of storming their meeting or tearing out the pipe with a tractor, I sat down with a notebook and a cup of coffee and began to map every connection the company had, who had signed what, which accounts received what, and when. It turns out running a local utility isn't magic. It's paperwork, permits, and the inevitable paper trail of human error and greed. I called an attorney who had represented cattlemen in small towns for years, a woman who made municipal lawyers squirm, and whose handwriting looked like it used to be written with tin. She smiled when I told her I owned the vendor, and said 2 words that made the room feel colder: conflict of interest. We filed an injunction that afternoon. The court's emergency clerk was kind and blunt. It would take time and money, but the temporary restraining order could stop the trenching at least long enough to put a halt on the machines. The HOA cried necessity. They cried safety. They filed affidavits. The judge signed a paper that read as a blade, and ordered the crews to stand down until the hearing. The men in orange vests looked at me like I'd pulled a rabbit from my hat. I didn't feel like a magician. I felt like a man who'd been late to his own party. The pipeline sat exposed and humming in its pause. I walked the line with my boots, watching the workers smoke and whisper. Some cursed. Some said we'd cost them their contract. The foreman told me he'd be back with a new permit stamped by a different office. I told him to pack up. In the weeks that followed, the story blossomed. It was small town, and it loved drama. The HOA argued that their water was at risk, that the main under the ridge had corrosion only a new path could fix. They had maps and engineers. I had deeds and a hidden ledger showing that the company they'd hired had been billing the HOA for emergency services it never provided, redirecting surcharges into an account labeled for infrastructure improvements that matched addresses of properties owned by the HOA board. At the hearing, the courtroom smelled of coffee and varnish. I sat at the plaintiff's table with my attorney. There were no TV cameras, but local blogs wrote like there had been. The HOA's counsel was smooth. He called experts. He suggested the pipeline would help the entire community. He used words like resilience and redundancy, like any good story about the public good. My lawyer walked the judge through chain of title, chain of custody, and chain of command. The judge was a practical man who'd grown up in a town where wells were inherited and property disputes were henpecked like chickens. He asked simple questions. Did the HOA have the right? Had anyone asked, why had the company billed in the way it did? The answers were messy. The judge's order that afternoon was careful. He found that the plaintiffs had shown a likelihood of success on the merits and that the balance of hardships favored preserving the status quo while we sorted out the facts. The machines remained idle. The HOA sent out another letter, this one more personal, accusing me of sabotage and litigiousness. I sent a certified response outlining the corporate relationship and requesting a forensic audit of the vendor's books. A forensic audit is like taking a skeleton out of a closet and naming its bones. Suddenly the books had entries that connected to HOA board members, to payments made under code names, to contracts issued without competitive bids. It was not a simple mistake. It looked more like a cozy arrangement where the vendor's friends and the HOA's leaders had worked together to reroute water through property they thought they could control and profit from by collecting surcharges and tapping into resale rights. The public turned. The same neighbors who'd voted to allow the easement a month earlier sent messages saying they'd been lied to. The HOA president, who'd once been a fixture at summer barbecues, found fewer invites. One by one, the little alliances frayed. The board's minutes leaked to a local investigative reporter and read like an old play where everyone forgot their lines. The community felt betrayed. I sat on my porch and watched the sunset lean over the pipeline like a long shadow. I thought about my father teaching me how to read the land, how to know where water ran by, watching the grass, where it gathered in hollows and where the cattle came in the spring. He told me that ownership was not just what's written on paper, but what you steward. I felt both kinds of ownership at once, the legal and the moral. But I also felt the surge of responsibility for the men who worked those machines and for the families in the subdivision who needed clean water. I didn't want to be the villain that cut off a child's faucet. I wanted accountability and fairness, not chaos. So, proposed a plan. I offered to negotiate a fair easement in exchange for oversight and competitive tendering of the work. I offered transparency and third-party audits. I offered to fund improvements in the old line so the HOA wouldn't have to pay an arm and a mortgage. And I offered, quietly, that if any of the board had profited improperly, we would make restitution and refer matters to the authorities. The HOA bristled. They wanted the easy way out. They wanted to finish and forget. Their counsel argued that delay would cost lives, but the truth was the board had lined pockets and justified each signature with the county's fear. After the report came in showing inflated invoices and suspicious fees, they had to decide whether to admit wrongdoing or fight. They chose to fight. The fight turned personal. A former friend on the board called me a profiteer, a hypocrite. He accused me of setting a trap, of using my company to manufacture a crisis. It hurt because some of those men had been at my weddings and funeral barbecues. They said I was doing it for money. I told them the truth, that because I owned the vendor, I stood to lose more reputation than I'd ever gain. I had spent years raising cattle, not running utility empires. But the ledger did not lie. One night, as winter crept with hard breaths across the plains, someone slashed the tires on my ranch truck. The police took reports and shrugged, used to rural trespass and vandalism. I thought about escalating, about hiring security, about legal theatrics that would swell the papers even higher. Instead, I drove to the meeting and showed up early with a thermos of coffee and a cooler of bottled water. I sat in the back and listened. They thought my silence was tactical. They didn't see the plan unfolding. I had arranged for an independent water engineer from the state university to come and assist both the old main and the proposed reroute. I had arranged for community meetings, for open ledgers online, for a hotline where anyone could report suspicious activity anonymously. I had arranged for my auditors to present the facts plainly. When the engineer spoke, she brought samples and charts and an old map where the main's corrosion was visible but repairable. She explained how a modest investment could restore the old line and add redundancy without carving a new path through my land. When the auditors presented, they showed the flow of money, like veins on a map, from HOA reserves to the vendor's account and back into the pockets of a handful of homeowners. The room went quiet, heavy with the moment when people understand they've been used. The HOA president's face tightened as board members exchanged glances. Some began to shift uncomfortably. Others went red and defiant. The truth has a quality of gravity. It bends conversations until people either fall or climb out. In the end, the HOA voted to halt the pipeline and accept a mediated settlement. They agreed to open bids for repairs, to dissolve any contracts that lacked oversight, and to resign any board members implicated in self-dealing. They agreed to a binding plan for fair compensation for the easement if ever needed, and to fund a community trust that would ensure future water projects had independent supervision. It was not everything I had wanted. It was not total vindication. A few lawsuits lingered. There were angry letters and threats, and a rumor mill that insists on creating myths out of dispute. But life on the ranch settled. The trench was filled, and the grass knit itself back together like a scar healing quiet. The windmill creaked, and the horses grazed where the pipeline had once been exposed. I kept the company, but I restructured it. I sold controlling interest to a cooperative of local farmers and townsfolk, people who had no reason to game the system. We installed an independent board and set transparent rates. I put in safeguards that would have stopped the scheme from happening in the first place. It felt like building a fence that would last. The HOA's president resigned in a public letter that used the word mistakes and apologized to a community he called family. Some accepted the apology, others still filed suits. The reporter who dug the story won an award, and for a while our county's name was in headlines. Then life moved on, as it always does, to new disputes and new reconciliations. At night I walked the land and listened to the creek gurgle where it always had. The pipeline that never was sits as a memory of the thin line between public need and private greed. The lesson settled into my bones. Ownership brings power, and power demands humility. When you hold both the well and the key, you earn the right to be trusted. If there is a moral to this, it is not drama. It's a quieter thing. It is the way a community can call itself out of error when given the truth, and the way a man can choose to be both stern and generous at once. It's the way the land remembers who it belongs to and reminds its people to be decent. The foreman who once cuffed his permit at me later knocked on my door and apologized. He said he didn't know how deep it went, just that orders came from above. I offered him a job doing maintenance work on the co-op lines and he accepted. We fixed the old main together under a hot July sun and passed a radio between us when the mosquitoes came. It was the least anyone could do. When visitors ask about the scar in the pasture, I tell them the truth, that money and fear will rearrange the map if you let them, but that stubbornness, law, and a little civic courage can right the course. I tell them that owning a company that supplies water isn't a trophy. It's a responsibility that requires you to be better than whatever you fear the world might do. And sometimes I stand at the fence and watch the subdivision's kid run with a soccer ball, their laughter rising like white smoke. I imagine taking them down the lane someday and showing them how to read the land, how to plant a willow where the water pools, how to listen for the soft language of streams. Maybe the world won't always be kind, but for all the arguments and all the courtrooms, the smaller work endures. At the end of the day, the ranch is quiet again. The pipeline that almost took more than soil taught me about the shape of power in our small town. It taught me how to use the levers of law and patience and transparency. It taught me that owning something gives you options, and that sometimes the best option is to give those options to the people who will keep them safe. Land forgives not quickly.